All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly fascinating journey to uncover the brutal, historical reality of one of history's most infamous figures, Pontius Pilate. We're going to strip away literally centuries of storytelling and look directly at the hard physical evidence left behind by the first-century historian Flavius Josephus. Now, if you think you know who Pilate was, you might want to brace yourself, because we are going to completely shatter that image. Over the course of this explainer, we're going to get a masterclass in historical pragmatism, ruthlessness, and the absolute limits of power. Let's get into it. Section 1. The myth versus historical reality. Okay, so we really need to start by addressing the elephant in the room here. For roughly 2 millennia, pop culture and religious traditions have painted a very specific picture of Pilate, right? We're used to the Gospels view, this hesitant, philosophizing, almost sympathetic bureaucrat, a man who famously, literally, washes his hands of guilt because he's just forced into a corner by an angry crowd. But according to Flavius Josephus, who is our absolute most detailed historical source from the first century, the reality was radically different. The real Pilate was a hard, uncompromising, and deeply cruel pragmatist. He had absolutely zero patience or understanding for Jewish religious sensitivities, and he never, ever hesitated to use overwhelming, brutal force to keep order. To truly grasp who this man was, we're going to look at what Josephus documented, 3 massive, defining conflicts during Pilate's rule. And together, they represent this one terrifying escalation of violence. They perfectly illustrate Pilate's brutal problem-solving tactics. You see, he wasn't a man who hesitated. He was a man who tested boundaries to see exactly what he could get away with. Section 2. The Imperial Banners Affair. Let's look at the very first of these major conflicts, which happened pretty much right after Pilate arrived in Judea. It is a textbook example of a new boss testing the waters. Pilate knew exactly what he was doing here. Previous Roman governors had intentionally avoided bringing anything bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem simply because strict Jewish laws absolutely forbade graven images in the Holy City. It was a massive red line. So what does Pilate do? Under the cover of total darkness, he sneaks military standards, complete with medallions featuring the face of Emperor Tiberius, right into the city. It was a blatant, massive provocation. And when the sun came up, well, the outrage was immediate. Thousands of Jewish citizens actually marched all the way to Pilate's headquarters in Caesarea, and they spent 5 straight days begging him to remove the banners. So on the 6th day, Pilate decides he has absolutely had enough of these protests. He has his soldiers completely surround the unarmed crowd, they draw their swords, and he threatens a wholesale massacre if everyone doesn't just pack up and go home. But the crowd's reaction totally stuns him. The protesters actually throw themselves to the ground, expose their bare necks to the Roman blades, and declare they would rather die than allow the Torah to be violated. Now remember, Pilate is a ruthless pragmatist. The crucial point here is his calculation. He realized that slaughtering thousands of unarmed people over some pieces of cloth would ignite a nationwide, uncontrollable revolt. And that was just bad for business. So doing the math, he backed down and ordered the banners removed. Section 3. The Bloody Temple Treasure. Now we move from intimidation to direct, hands-on violence in what became known as the Bloody Temple Treasure Incident. Pilate's patience for peaceful resolution was essentially zero by this point. Jerusalem desperately needed better water infrastructure, so Pilate decided to build a new aqueduct. Sounds like a practical Roman project, right? But to fund it, Pilate brazenly confiscated the Corban. The Corban was the immensely sacred temple treasure. It was strictly, unequivocally reserved for religious purposes only. Taking it for a civil engineering project was an absolute sacrilege. Naturally, when Pilate showed up in Jerusalem, a massive, angry, insulting mob surrounded him to protest this theft. But Pilate had learned a valuable lesson from his first mistake. He was definitely not going to have a public standoff with drawn swords this time. Instead, he ordered his heavily armed Roman soldiers to dress in regular civilian clothing, hide clubs and daggers right under their tunics, and secretly mingle deep into the heart of the screaming, protesting mob. Once they were perfectly in position, Pilate gave an agreed-upon signal. Suddenly, the disguised soldiers pulled their weapons and just began brutally beating and stabbing the crowd. Countless protesters were bludgeoned to death right there, and many, many more were completely trampled in the absolute panic that followed. It was a terrifyingly efficient, covert, and incredibly bloody suppression of dissent. Section 4. Massacre on Mount Gerizim. And that brings us to the third and final incident documented by Josephus. This event really shows Pilate's escalating paranoia and his total willingness to use full-scale military warfare against civilians. This time, the conflict didn't even involve the Jewish population, but the Samaritans. A self-proclaimed prophet had somehow managed to convince a huge crowd of Samaritans to follow him to their sacred mountain, Mount Gerizim. This prophet promised that once they reached the very top, he would reveal holy vessels that had been hidden there by Moses himself. Now, this crowd of pilgrims was armed, which honestly was pretty common in the ancient world just for protection on the road. But Pilate? He didn't see a religious pilgrimage. He looked at that crowd and saw the sparks of a full-blown military uprising. And this brilliantly, terrifyingly illustrates Pilate's fundamental nature. He did not wait around to ask questions. Pilate preemptively deployed his heavy infantry and his cavalry. The Roman military completely blocked the road up the mountain, trapping the pilgrims. And without a second of hesitation, Pilate's forces initiated a mass slaughter. The crowd was completely decimated. Those who weren't killed in the initial attack were captured, and Pilate ordered the immediate execution of all the most prominent Samaritan leaders. There was no trial, there was no negotiation. It was just absolute, devastating force. Section 5, the end of the Roman prefect. So this massacre on Mount Gerizim, that was the breaking point. Because even in the brutal ancient Roman Empire, there was a limit to how much unprovoked slaughter a governor could get away with before causing massive administrative headaches for Rome. Let's trace how this all fell apart for him. Following the bloodshed in 36 AD, the surviving Samaritan council had had enough. They formally complained to Pilate's direct superior, Vitellius, who was the very powerful Roman legate in Syria. Vitellius actually investigates this and completely agrees with the Samaritans. He realized Pilate had severely overreached and become a total liability. So by late 36 or early 37 AD, Vitellius literally fires Pilate, strips him of his title, and orders him back to Rome to face Emperor Tiberius and answer for his excessive brutality. But history loves a twist, right? In March 37 AD, literally just before Pilate finally arrived in Rome, Emperor Tiberius died. And after that, Pilate just completely vanishes from the historical record. To this day, we have no idea what his ultimate fate was. Section 6. The real reason for Jesus' execution. Now, with this historically verified, blood-soaked resume fresh in our minds, let's pivot to the most famous event of Pilate's entire career. Why did Pilate really execute Jesus? Knowing what we now know about this ruthless, impatient tyrant, does the cultural story of a conflicted governor making agonizing choices, pacing the halls, super worried about the fate of an itinerant preacher, does that make any sense at all? To really answer that, we have to look back to Flavius Josephus and a very famous passage known as the Testimonium Flavianum. This is a brief section in Josephus's massive work where he explicitly mentions Jesus. Now, yes, historians widely acknowledge that later medieval Christian scribes added some flowery religious language to this text over the centuries. I mean, Josephus was an Orthodox Jew. He wouldn't have called Jesus the Messiah. But scholars absolutely agree the historical core of the text is authentic. And that core, it is remarkably brief and ice cold. Josephus simply states that upon hearing an indictment from local leaders, Pilate condemned Jesus to the cross. And this brings us to the most critical takeaway of this whole explainer. For Rome, and specifically for a guy like Pilate, this execution was not a profound philosophical debate or some deeply agonizing religious event. It was handled as a standard, cold-blooded administrative procedure. Pilate saw a figure gathering massive crowds during a highly volatile religious festival. To Pilate, that probably looked exactly like the Samaritan prophet gathering a crowd on Mount Gerizim all over again. Eliminating a potential public nuisance swiftly and brutally, that perfectly fit his established profile. He didn't agonize, he didn't philosophize. There is simply zero historical room for the hesitant ruler myth. He signed the order because that is exactly how Pontius Pilate solved problems. As we wrap up this explainer today, I really want to leave you with this final thought. Pontius Pilate didn't wash his hands of guilt. He ruled with an iron fist. The actual history we uncover often completely upends the comfortable stories we've been told for centuries. By relying on the hard evidence from Josephus, we recover a chilling but authentic portrait of a merciless pragmatist. And honestly, it really makes you wonder, if the story of Pontius Pilate could be this heavily distorted over time, how many other famous historical narratives are out there hiding an equally shocking reality, just waiting to be uncovered? Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.